We all know Sony Animation, the studio behind some of the greatest animated films of our time, and, let's be honest, some of the absolute worst. I mean, following up the Smurfs and the Emoji Movie with Spider-Verse? That's not just wild, that's downright diabolical. So yeah, calling them confusing would be putting it mildly. But here's the real question. Why are they so inconsistent? And even more interesting, could that inconsistency actually be the very thing that turns Sony into the best animation studio of the next 5 years? See, there's a secret no one really talks about. And when I started digging into how Sony Animation actually operates, what I found honestly blew my mind. Here's the thing. Sony founded its animation division back in 2002. But unlike Disney or Studio Ghibli, it wasn't built out of a deep love for the craft. Instead, Sony looked at the massive success of movies like Shrek and Monsters, Inc. and thought, we want in on that. The result? A studio with huge ambitions, but no real creative DNA at its core. Their first film, Open Season in 2006, actually did really well at the box office. But let's be real, it was a pretty average kids movie. Fun enough, but forgettable. It wasn't until their second outing that Sony truly raised the bar, with Surf's Up, a film that not only performed well in theaters, but also won over audiences with its creativity, humor, and surprisingly clever storytelling. I mean, it was an animated mockumentary comedy film that's unique as hell, and even though it came out after a ton of other Penguin movies like Madagascar, Happy Feet, etc., Surf's Up was able to distinguish itself and went on to earn an Oscar nomination. These early films proved Sony had technical skill and talent. They just needed to keep raising the bar. And that's where things got interesting. Because unlike Pixar, which built its identity around emotionally resonant storytelling and innovative 3D animation, or DreamWorks, which leaned into irreverent wit and pop culture, Sony didn't double down on a single style. Actually, the rule at SPA was they wouldn't adhere to any one specific visual style. Each movie would be its own universe. They kept bouncing between genres, tones, and creative leads. And while that made their output feel scattered, it also made everything unique and fun, and was the reason Sony would end up defying all expectations. But we'll touch on that in a bit. In 2009, Sony released Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, directed by none other than Phil Lord and Chris Miller. And it was that exact lack of identity and creative vision that allowed them to experiment and flourish creatively. It was a weird, stylized comedy that took an absurd premise, food falling from the sky, and pushed it to visual and narrative extremes. When most animated movies seem to be leaning into realism as much as possible, SPA's creative flexibility allowed Phil and Chris to push the boundaries. The movie was chaotic and bursting with personality, but more than anything, it felt like the product of a very specific creative vision, and that decision turned out to be pivotal. Not only was Cloudy their most successful movie to date critically and at the box office, it also planted a seed that maybe Sony's identity wasn't about finding a formula, but rejecting one altogether. That maybe, instead of one voice, the studio could become a platform for many. This sounded like a great thing in practice, but it meant there would be many, and I mean many, flops thereafter. From Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Arthur Christmas and Hotel Transylvania were two bright spots in a sea of mediocrity for the studio. It was hard to pinpoint what to expect from Sony in any given year, and they ended up falling victim to the sequel curse, releasing 10 goddamn sequels in 10 years, from 2008 to 2018. Not only that, the Smurfs, the Angry Birds Movie 2, and the Emoji Movie felt like attempts to chase trends and cash in on IP, which resulted in movies that made Sony quickly become the laughingstock of the entire industry. But running parallel to that was something else that nobody could have seen coming. The seeds of one of the greatest animated trilogies of all time were being planted and watered. Because while the Emoji Movie was being memed into oblivion, Lord, Miller, and the Sony executives were quietly laying the foundation for something far more ambitious. After proving themselves with Cloudy, They had gone on to direct the Lego Movie for Warner Brothers, a banger of a movie that reinforced just how bold their style could be and how easily they could handle legacy IP, which is not an easy thing to do. It was sharp, it was self-aware, and it forced people to take this style of storytelling seriously. At this point, the Lego Movie is considered an animated classic, and Sony definitely took notice. So when the idea of an animated Spider-Man film came around, something that had every reason to be just another safe, kid-friendly spin-off, Sony decided they needed creators who could actually push boundaries and treat a legacy like Spider-Man with ambition and respect. That's when they handed the reins to Lord and Miller, and instead of playing it safe or pumping out a cash-grab superhero flick, they went completely off the rails, in the best way possible. Amy Pascal, who was overseeing the Spider-Man franchise at the time, even admitted later that the smartest thing she did was just staying quiet and letting them work. The result was Into the Spider-Verse, a film that was the complete opposite of what anyone expected from Sony Animation. It was stylish, heartfelt, hilarious, and packed with a level of visual experimentation that no major Western studio had attempted on that scale since Pixar back in the 90s. Overnight, Sony wasn't just catching up, they were leading the charge in a brand new direction. While Disney and Pixar chased pristine, hyper-realistic CG, Spider-Verse sprinted the other way. Broken frame rates, comic book halftones, graffiti textures, hand-drawn flourishes, color-coded universes. It didn't just look like a comic book, it felt alive, like one exploding off the page. Audiences adored it. Critics praised it, animators across the world were inspired by it, and on top of everything, it went on to win the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. But maybe the most important thing it proved about Sony is this: their chaos, their lack of a single house style, their messy, inconsistent approach. That was the very thing that made Spider-Verse possible. If Sony had been more cautious, more uniform, more brand conscious, this movie never would have made it past the pitch stage. Or, at the very least, it wouldn't have been the bold, risk-taking masterpiece that redefined modern animation. Of course, that same chaos that gave birth to Spider-Verse would also create big problems for Sony down the line. But we'll get to that later. So yes, Sony spent a decade shooting blanks for the most part, but all the while they were also building a culture that, when paired with the right creatives, could result in something magical. And after Into the Spider-Verse, everyone else started paying attention. Studios scrambled to capture that same unpredictable visual magic. Suddenly, stylization was all the craze. DreamWorks leaned into expressive, beautiful stylized animation with The Bad Guys, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, and The Wild Robot. Netflix pushed out Nimona, Intergalactic. Even Disney tried to do their own stylized animation with Wish, although we all know how that turned out. And while the rest of the industry was still trying to catch up, Sony had already moved on, backing The Mitchells vs. the Machines, a movie that blended heartwarming family drama with chaotic internet energy, all with another awesomely stylized animation style. It became one of the most refreshingly original animated films in years and earned them another Oscar nomination. Sony had finally discovered its creative voice. If Into the Spider-Verse proved that taking bold risks could pay off, then Across the Spider-Verse showed that doubling down on that freedom, even at the cost of pure chaos behind the scenes, could deliver true greatness. I mean, Across the Spider-Verse became the highest-grossing Sony animated movie ever and earned them their third Oscar nomination in 5 years, which is insane. Sony had made it, a studio that was finally respected and considered among the upper echelon of animation. But yet, behind the scenes, something dark had been brewing for years. While Sony's outside facade was one of success, innovation, and creative risk, there were major cracks that the studio was covering up. Cracks that could threaten to undermine everything Sony had built. Because while the stylistic inconsistency and creative chaos can clearly be a recipe for greatness, it can also lead to absolute disaster. And nowhere is that clearer than behind the scenes of the Spider-Verse movies. While we were all blown away by the visuals and storytelling, the reality for the animation teams was a different story entirely. As I talked about in my previous Spider-Verse video, the production process was insanely grueling. Artists were often left in the dark about what sequences were final. Entire scenes were reanimated from scratch, sometimes multiple times, and the direction frequently unclear, often contradictory, and constantly shifting. This was the byproduct of a studio culture that thrives on spontaneity and last-minute creative pivots, with two people like Chris and Phil that relish in that sort of atmosphere. Phil's grip on the film was especially tight, with Amy and other producers having a more hands-off approach, and Phil's notes and comments taking precedence over anything the director said. Compare this to how studios like Pixar and Disney operate. These movies have super large budgets, yes, but the bulk of that money and time goes into development, years of storyboarding. By the time they enter full production, the vision is usually locked. They don't waste animation on scrapped ideas because the ideas were solidified long before rendering even began. Sony, on the other hand, dove into production with many of its key ideas still evolving. This meant animators were constantly playing catch-up. One day, a scene was approved. The next, it was being thrown out or completely reworked. And when you're working in a medium where every second of footage requires hundreds of hours of labor, that's just a ridiculous way of working. Many of the artists who worked on Across the Spider-Verse have spoken about the toll it took. Long hours, relentless pressure, and an endless cycle of revisions. The irony, of course, is that out of all that chaos came one of the most celebrated animated films of the decade. But it raises a tough question. Can any studio sustain this level of experimentation without sacrificing the well-being of its artists? That's the paradox of Sony Animation. Their inconsistency sparks radical brilliance, but left unchecked, it can just as easily lead to burnout. And yet, even with all of that, I still believe Sony is on track to become the best animation studio of the next 5 years. Why? Because for all its flaws, that chaos is also their greatest strength. It's what allows them to take risks that no other studio would dare. Yes, their track record is unpredictable, but their upcoming slate might be the clearest sign yet that Sony Animation is evolving, not into the most consistent studio, but into the boldest, and maybe, just maybe, the most important. One of the standout hits from Sony Animation this year is none other than K-pop Demon Hunters. Premiering on Netflix, the film instantly blew up, turning into a global sensation. It blends dazzling animation, electrifying music, and a wild, original premise about a K-pop girl group that moonlights as demon slayers. The result? A cultural phenomenon. Social media is buzzing, critics are applauding Sony's bold creative gamble, and fans are already hailing it as one of the most unforgettable animated releases of the year. They've got Black Knight, an animated fantasy epic from the same guy, a Mitchells vs. the Machines sequel, which is one of the few sequels I'm genuinely excited for. They've got an animated sports comedy movie about a goat that dreams of going pro in his favorite sport. And of course, Spider-Man, Beyond the Spider-Verse, the final chapter that could cement this as the best animated trilogy of all time. But what's most exciting about all these projects is that they're mostly original stories. I mean, they have 7 original projects coming out from this point forward. And on top of that, in 2020, they stated they wanted to focus more on R-rated animated movies, which is a completely different approach to other major studios and is so incredibly exciting. Honestly, what they're doing is so rare in today's animation landscape. Disney is leaning harder than ever into sequels and remakes, and even their original stuff seems incredibly bland and safe. Pixar is kind of doing the same with 3 out of their 5 upcoming movies being sequels. Meanwhile, Sony is completely setting themselves apart, and somehow, even with all the chaos, or maybe because of it, they're creating space for the next wave of animation innovation. So yes, Sony is still inconsistent. They still frustrate their artists. But if they can refine their process, improve working conditions without killing that spark of chaos, and keep betting on bold, creative risks, then I truly believe Sony could be the studio that defines the next decade of animation.